I thank the chair. Mr. Olson, I was honored to serve as a career prosecutor with the Department of Justice at the U.S. Attorney's Office, primarily part of the time at Maine Justice for 15 years. I understand what you're saying about revealing information about ongoing investigations. I understand what you're saying about or at least I understand your reticence in answering some of the questions, but I think it would comfort the American people, and I had some prepared questions, and I'm going to someday hopefully get answers to those questions, but I think it would comfort the American people to know that you get it. I now have the honor of listening over and over, practically every weekend, to constituents who are afraid that the federal government is getting into an area that it shouldn't get into. State and local officials can handle protests, threats, violent acts, and they're fairly rare when you look at all of the school board meetings that are going on across this country. It would be comforting for all of us to hear that you understand that it is not a federal issue. Antifa is a federal issue. White nationalism is. I hope you eradicate white nationalism in this country. I think everybody on this side of the aisle and that side of the aisle would agree on that. I hope that there are no Nazis left in the United States who would commit a violent act. Now, if there's people that believe things, we don't go after them for their beliefs. But anybody who would commit a violent act because of white supremacist beliefs or white nationalist beliefs, by all means, look at that at a national level, because it is of a national scope. But school board meetings and the threats against school board meetings, it concerns a lot of us greatly that there is actually a tag that's associated with that. And I give you an opportunity to answer that. I'd like to ask a couple of other questions too.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think I agree completely with everything you just said. By and large, what we're talking about when it comes to threats of violence directed against state and local officials, school board members, those are matters that are going to be handled by state and local prosecutors and law enforcement. And they always have been, and they must, I think, continue to be. There is a role for the federal government, certainly with the national level cases you're talking about, and whether we're talking about racially motivated violence, domestic violent extremism. There may be a case at the state and local level, that the rare case that rises, but I do think you're right that that's where, look, I'm a parent of 3 children. My son is sitting behind me. I've been to school board meetings. I've spoken, much to his dismay, at school board meetings. I understand that parents absolutely have a right to be involved and should be involved in speaking up and disagreeing vociferously at times with the decisions that are being made at the local level. And absolutely, we are committed. I personally am committed, the National Security Division is committed to protecting the rights of parents, citizens, to speak out, to voice their concerns, even if we don't agree. We really need to draw that line between that free speech that we cherish and violence, and that's the line that we draw. And I also agree we need to be thoughtful about the role that the federal government plays, and to play an appropriate role, often in partnership and support of state and local law enforcement.
And I appreciate you saying that, and I think it does comfort the American people that a leader says that, and I want to make sure your son understands that he should be very proud of his father's service to our country. I want to ask, though, there's another area that concerns me, and another area that I continue to hear concern from my constituents, and that is that the riots on January 6th in the United States Capitol were horrific. They were intended to disrupt a legitimate government function, and they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The riots that occurred throughout our country in the summer of 2020 were horrific. They were damaging. And many of the American people in my district, and granted, it's a fairly rural district and a fairly conservative district, but many of those people expressed concerns that there is not a parity between the attention that was given to those that committed crimes on January 6th and those that committed crimes throughout the summer of 2020. And furthermore, as part of that analysis, the crimes that were committed on throughout the summer of 2020 appeared to be coordinated. And I'd like to ask you very specifically, can you tell this committee that George Soros was not behind, and his money was not behind, directly or indirectly, the Antifa activities that occurred in the summer of 2020?
Yeah, certainly any of the work I've done, I've never seen any suggestion of that. However, that's not really something that I would look at in terms of the cases that we handle in the National Security Division. But I do agree with you that we need to look, and we are looking even-handedly across the board, whether we're talking about crimes committed during the riots and destruction of the summer of 2020 and at the horrific attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and using the tools that we have. The reality is that the thousands of arrests that occurred in the summer of 2020, most of those were handled by state and local, as they should have been. The difference, of course, in some ways that I think accounts for the attention paid on January 6th, beyond the nature of that attack and the significance of it, is that most of those crimes are federal crimes, if not all, because the target was the Capitol. So I do think that accounts for some of the difference in view when it comes to the role of the federal government. But the fundamental point that you make, I completely agree with. We need to be apolitical in how we handle these cases, and we need to look across the board and be driven by the nature of the threats we face.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Swalwell from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Olson, my Republican colleagues have said over and over that school board violence is, quote, fairly rare. A Reuters story on February 15, 2022 begins with, "The letter came to the home of Brenda Sheridan, a Loudoun County, Virginia school board member, addressed to one of her adult children. It threatened to kill them both unless she left the board. It's too bad that your mother is an ugly communist whore," said the hand-scrawled note, which the family read just after Christmas. "If she doesn't quit or resign before the end of the year, we will kill her, but first, we will kill you." The story goes on to document over 220 examples of such violent intimidation, and I'd like to enter that under unanimous consent into the record.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. Olson, what concerns me is that you're being questioned by a lot who has become more comfortable with violence than voting, that has associated itself more with chaos than community. But do you agree that what I just described to you is something that law enforcement should be concerned about and that law enforcement should investigate?
I mean, absolutely. Anyone who serves in a position such as a school board member should be free from the fear of threats of violence or acts of violence. Absolutely.
And I'm the son of a school board member myself, someone who signed up to serve for the same reason I think you signed up to serve. Do you also agree that if a parent goes and peacefully but very passionately describes their own beliefs about their child's curriculum, that person should not be investigated?
Of course. That's protected by our First Amendment.
And I have to say, I'm not surprised that there are so many acts that are hardly fairly rare of violence, because in this building, America's leaders are stoking that violence. So many of my colleagues now on their social media, they love to hold their assault rifle and threaten the president to come and get it. They love to use their social media accounts to threaten to kill the Speaker of the House. That has happened. They have used their social media accounts to depict themselves in anime as killing the President of the United States. So it would not surprise me that people in their community would go to a school board meeting and act the way that I just described. And I'm grateful that you're investigating people who would threaten violence. And I'm also grateful that you are not investigating people who have legitimate concerns about their children's curriculum. And also, I just have to debunk the Soros nonsense. Thank you for clarifying that. That's a part of a long-standing anti-Semitic trope that we see from the other side that goes after George Soros, that goes after Michael Bloomberg, and any Jewish individual who contributes to campaigns to suggest that they support and fund violence. And it's incomparable to take the violence that occurred during protests of the summer of 2020 and what happened in this Capitol, the largest crime ever investigated as far as number of individuals investigated, indicted, sentenced. So thank you for that. I want to ask you just briefly about the antitrust legislation that my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, referenced. And my concern and the concern of others on this committee is that if we were to have side loading, so to take Apple's store, for example, and require them to take on apps from anywhere, essentially take a curated app store and allow it to be a flea market where anyone can come in and sell, their apps on the platform. There are concerns about security, whether, the Chinese would flood the app store with their own apps that could vacuum up U.S. consumer data and send it back to Beijing, not only making our privacy affected, but also, any people in the intelligence community, or Russia using the platform to flood it with apps that could, sow disinformation, whether it's our own elections or its campaign in Ukraine. Would you be willing, Mr. Olson, to listen to evidence from other parts of the intelligence community if they have new concerns that came out after the letter that your agency sent as it relates to the antitrust legislation?
Yes. As we had the chance to talk about
I'm sorry, I meant the Department of Justice.
Yes, yes. As this legislation moved through the process, we did have the opportunity to comment on it, and I do think some of the provisions that were incorporated addressed national security concerns. But of course, if there are additional issues or concerns that are raised, particularly by our intelligence community, it'll be incumbent on us in the Justice Department and elsewhere to take those seriously.
Great, thank you, and I yield back.